From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Anne-Marie Hordern. Luxury vacations, private resorts, and trips on a super yacht. Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas and his wife Ginny facing ethics questions after a news report reveals major gifts from Republican billionaire. Top lawmakers are promising action.
And the debt ceiling back in focus. The Biden administration trades jabs with GOP leadership as the U.S. pushes closer to default. But elsewhere, Democrats and Republicans find some common ground.
What China needs to understand is they can't dictate who a Speaker of the House can meet with, maybe with foe or friend.
We have more highlights from my interview with House Speaker Kevin McCarthy and what it means for U.S.-China relations. That's coming up. Joe, it's so great to be back in Washington, D.C., although it's not as sunny as
not quite as nice as Simi Valley, huh?
Yeah, it's not quite as nice as Southern California. But it's a shortened week, 4 days, but it feels like we have enough news for a year. Remember,
this is a lifetime.
The start of this week was the Trump arraignment, and now we're talking about a muted response from Beijing and potentially ethics violations by a Supreme Court justice.
Yeah, we've got a lot to cover. It really has been just a ridiculous news cycle, kind of the hurricane of news. That Trump indictment, the arraignment itself, was 2 days ago. Yeah. You were in New York. Kevin McCarthy makes news yesterday. Here we are with this bombshell on Clarence Thomas today.
Yes, absolutely. And that's what we're going to dig into. Around the table with us today are Bloomberg's Megan Scully and Ian Marlowe. Both of you, thank you so much for joining. Let's start with the news today out of the Supreme Court, or a report about the Supreme Court justice. Congress now up in arms. Will they actually do something? Or did he even break an ethics violation?
So it gets a little complicated. To your first question about Congress, we heard from Senate Democrats today as the Judiciary Chairman, Senator Durbin, basically issued a call to action. He wants to pass legislation addressing this. The issue here, though, is that the justices are the only members of the federal judiciary who don't have to adhere to this code of conduct. It's also a little murky whether current laws on gifting pertain to the Supreme Court or not. And remember, the final arbiter of where laws apply and to whom and how is the Supreme Court.
For those who haven't caught up with all of this, it's a ProPublica report, and it has to do with, hundreds of thousands of dollars. I don't know if there's an actual full tally on this, that a major Republican donor, Harlan Crow, gave to Clarence Thomas. The reaction we just showed from Dick Durbin, the highest court in the land should not have the lowest ethical standards. Does it?
Well, they don't technically have a code of ethics. So
there's no mechanism to sort of work through this, right?
There is not. So they typically do send disclosures in, but they say they do this sort of out of the goodness of their hearts, not because they are actually required to. Mm-hmm. And Congress wants to essentially have the judicial ethics extend to the Supreme Court, or at least that's what Senate Democrats are saying they want to do. But if that were ever challenged, it would be challenged at the Supreme Court and decided by Supreme Court justices.
I think we should also let our viewers know that Harlan Crow has come out with this statement, and he's saying he wasn't trying to be involved in anything in terms of an ethics violation, that his wife, Kathy, and him have been friends with Justice Thomas and his wife since the late 1990s. They're dear friends. Hospitality we extend to them is the same we have for hospitality of friends. Is that going to be a way potentially that Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas can get around this? This was my friend. I guess it's just the issue is the dollar signs. Mm-hmm.
The issue is the dollar signs. I think one estimate was one of the vacations that involved island hopping on a private yacht came to $500,000, which is definitely more luxurious than any vacation I've been on. But, you know, I don't think he broke a law here, or perhaps he did, but we'll see that in the weeks to come. It's really the public perception, though. He's already been mired in controversy given his wife's connections to the Trump White House and kind of what that means. We saw some calls from Democrats for his resignation again. So
here are some pictures from that ProPublica report, by the way. I don't know if you got to look at that yacht, Anne-Marie, but I mean, this was one heck of a trip. This is not some fishing trip that you might be thinking about. A $500,000 island hopping trip, and they know how to do it up in the Berkshires.
The Adirondacks.
Yeah, the Adirondacks.
It's pretty incredible, also including private chefs and the likes, which, journalists, lawmakers, White House officials, they're not allowed to accept gifts.
Right.
So I think that's where Congress is going to be able to potentially get a leg up in terms of, well, we have to abide by these rules.
Consider campaign finance reform. That ended the power lunch circuit in Washington, right? Or at least it changed who paid for it, didn't it?
Yes. And I think the law there is, you can't eat with a fork, right? So, but again, the Supreme Court has long held fast that these laws don't necessarily apply to them and that they go along with it. So it's really going to be an interesting legal question in the coming weeks.
Okay, so that was the big story today. Yesterday, of course, a huge story was an unprecedented visit on U.S. soil with a Speaker of the House and the Taiwanese president. Take a listen to what Speaker McCarthy said to me after his meeting.
If we want to make sure that we foster democracy and peace and make sure we don't get into any type of conflict, people need to sit down. And what China needs to understand is they can't dictate who a Speaker of the House can meet with, maybe with foe or friend. For the same moment that Macron's sitting down with President Xi, I think that's great. I would sit down with President Xi.
Potentially, we're going to see a Speaker McCarthy trip, not to Taipei, but to Beijing. Ian, a muted response, though, from China.
Yeah, I think so. I think especially given what happened after former Speaker Pelosi visited Taiwan, everyone was expecting fireworks to some extent. Last time there was military exercises. They fired missiles over the island into Japanese waters. We saw an effective blockade around the island. There was a lot of stuff they could have done in terms of her deciding to meet McCarthy in the U.S. Again, it's an unprecedented trip, even though the White House and other people have tried to maintain it was routine. This is just a transit. This has happened before. There's a lot of stuff they could have done, and they didn't do it. So that's kind of one of the interesting developments, I think, especially given the sort of heated rhetoric and quite hawkish rhetoric we hear on China in D.C. all the time.
It's fascinating. Within 24 hours of that meeting that caused so much consternation in Beijing, there's another Codell over in Taiwan right now. Congressman McCall of the Foreign Affairs Committee brought his own group of folks there to visit the island. Is that more frequent travel going to help normalize this? I mean, they can't send an aircraft carrier into the South China Sea every time a congressman gets on an airplane.
Yeah, exactly. I think that was, especially on the Taiwanese side, the hope about what came out of Pelosi's visit before, which was that it was such an extreme visit, it was such an extreme response, that after that they hoped that it would be a little bit more normal. You could see higher level officials, not just from the U.S., but from France, from the U.K., from Japan, from other places as well, going to Taiwan. And I think partially, at the moment, you're seeing China sort of strike that balance. I mean, they went out so far in terms of responding to Pelosi that they're now, kind of trying to hold their powder to some extent. They can't do this every time, really.
But also, Taipei, this party, Tsai Ing-wen's party, there's going to be a huge election in January, and potentially China doesn't want to have all these threats, right? And just push people towards that party that is definitely way more progressive and wants liberation?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we saw this. I mean, I used to be based in Hong Kong when China cracked down on Hong Kong following the democratic protests there. You saw opinion in Taiwan swing against China. People wanted less to do with China. People started identifying in polling more and more as Taiwanese and not Chinese. So you see China's foreign policy and its assertiveness, not just to Hong Kong or Taiwan, but in the region, this has an impact on Taiwanese public opinion. And I think Beijing is also trying to tread carefully there because they don't want to swing the election, against their favor, basically.
Right. This whole conversation is taking place as Emmanuel Macron makes a visit to Beijing to meet with President Xi. What's on the agenda there? Obviously, Xi's got a lot of plates he's spinning at once here. Is this a focus on Ukraine, and can President Xi potentially breakthrough here in peace talks?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's been a lot of skepticism about the Chinese peace plan, given China's ties with Russia and the sort of no limits
Is he seen
partnership.
as an honest broker in that conversation?
I think the U.S. doesn't see him as an honest broker. They're trying to play a little bit coy in terms of how they respond to China's moves here, because diplomacy between the U.S. and Russia is so fraught at the moment. No one's sitting down. So if anyone's going to do something, maybe it could be China. I don't think anyone has high hopes, but Europe has a very different relationship with China than the U.S. does. It's not as controversial. There's German automakers. There's all these relationships that Europe has to manage with China that the U.S. kind of doesn't have to as much. So it would be interesting to see what kind of finally comes out of this. I don't think anyone's expecting any breakthroughs, but he occupies a different position and can have those conversations in Beijing that are different than, say, Blinken, who
hasn't even happened.
Who couldn't even go.
Yeah.
He couldn't go because it was such a hot topic after the spy balloon episode here. So U.S.-China ties pretty much frozen, but there's movement for other people to get some progress there maybe.
Great insights from our reporter roundtable to get things rolling today. Many thanks to Bloomberg's Megan Scully and Ian Marlowe. Coming up, we'll have more on Taiwan's political gambit here after President Tsai's meeting with lawmakers in California.
In the discussion with congressional leaders this morning, I reiterated Taiwan's commitment to defending the peaceful status quo, where the people of Taiwan may continue to thrive in a free and open society.
We'll talk about China's reaction or lack thereof next with David Sachs, research fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. That's next on Balance of Power. This is Bloomberg.
Being here, I think, sends a signal to the Chinese Communist Party that the United States supports Taiwan and that we're going to harden Taiwan, and we want them to think twice about invading Taiwan.
Texas Congressman Michael McCall landing in Taiwan earlier today with a bipartisan congressional delegation just hours after the meeting between Speaker McCarthy and President Tsai. China's Ministry of National Defense had strong words for the U.S., as you might expect, saying, quote, in response to the seriously erroneous acts of collusion between the United States and Taiwan, China will take resolute and effective measures to safeguard national sovereignty and territorial integrity, unquote. Joining us now, David Sachs, research fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. David, it's great to see you. Thanks for talking with us today on Bloomberg. The lack of response, really, from China, despite all the bluster, has been making more headlines since the meeting yesterday with the Speaker of the House. Are we going to see any more than an aircraft carrier, which was a concern yesterday, kind of dipping its toe into waters around Taiwan?
I think we'll see some more steps by the Chinese to impose costs on Taiwan for having this meeting between President Tsai and Speaker McCarthy. So, for instance, China announced that its Coast Guard would conduct searches in the Taiwan Strait of vessels, including those flying the Taiwanese flag. We'll have to see how China chooses to actually implement that. But if it does seek to board and search Taiwanese vessels and Taiwan doesn't comply and Taiwan's government has said it won't comply, then we could see tensions ratchet up a little. But it remains to be seen whether that's a symbolic response or whether that is really something that China intends to do. We should also note that China's response to this meeting actually started around 1 week ago or so when it peeled away Taiwan's diplomatic partner Honduras, which switched recognition from Taiwan to the PRC. So we've already seen a couple of steps. There might also be token economic sanctions on Taiwanese firms from districts that tend to vote for the DPP, the party in power that President Tsai represents.
David, do you think the response would have been different had Speaker McCarthy taken this trip and had this meeting in Taipei and not in California?
Absolutely. I think that the change in venue mattered a lot. A lot of the response to Speaker Pelosi's trip to Taiwan was because of the fact that she flew to Taiwan and became the highest ranking official to travel there since 1979. If Speaker McCarthy had chosen to go ahead with a trip to Taiwan, I think China's response likely would have been similar to what it did after Speaker Pelosi visited, or even a Pelosi plus, so to speak, with large-scale military exercises, missile tests, economic sanctions, and other coercive measures aimed at Taiwan.
Okay, so after this then, David, as long as Beijing threatens resolute measures and does nothing, is this the boy who cried wolf?
Well, I think that that's probably a fear in Beijing, that it has to strike a delicate balance here. It wants to impose costs on Taiwan and the United States, deter both parties from moving forward and building the relationship and becoming closer and closer to one another. But at the same time, we're in an election season in Taiwan. They're going to go to the polls in January of next year. And Beijing knows from past experience that if it pushes too hard and is too forceful, it's going to get the outcome that it's trying to avoid, which is a DPP victory in the election. So the crackdown in Hong Kong in 2020 greatly benefited Tsai, who was struggling in the polls as she went up for re-election. And if you go back to the Taiwan Strait crisis in 1995-96, China's missile tests at that time actually helped the incumbent Lee Teng-hui get re-elected as well, which was the outcome that Beijing was trying to avoid. So I think that it's trying to strike a balance here, and I think that's why Beijing will do potentially some more measures to impose a cost on Taiwan, but I don't think it's going to go so far where it's going to turn voters away from the KMT and towards the DPP. And here, of course, we had an amazing split screen where you had the former KMT president Ma traveling to China, and those reassurances and the words that he spoke, which was music to Xi Jinping's ears, probably also contributed to a more moderate response, because they're looking ahead and seeing that if the KMT regains power, maybe there's a potential for a cross-strait rapprochement.
That's what I was going to ask you about. You have another unprecedented trip taking place, not just a quick stopover, 10 days. Tsai Ing-wen's predecessors spent in China. You also had another amazing split screen with Xi Jinping sitting down with Ursula von der Leyen and Emmanuel Macron. Do you think that those officials, the Europeans there, also meant he wanted to show a restrained response?
I think that also could have contributed to it. I mean, Xi Jinping doesn't want to be confronted by Macron in Beijing regarding China's policy towards Taiwan and be seen as provocative. So Xi might believe that showing some restraint will make Macron kind of more amenable to Xi's position on Ukraine or on commercial ties or things like that. So I think that all of this contributed to a softer response from China. But I would say that I think 24 hours after the meeting between Tsai and McCarthy, I don't think we've seen the end of it. So I think we do still have to wait a couple of days and even weeks and see what Beijing might roll out. So I just think it's too soon to say that we've seen it all and there's nothing really to look at here.
To stick with that meeting with Emmanuel Macron for a moment, David, what role do you see President Xi playing in a peace deal with Ukraine, or is that not realistic right now?
Well, I don't think anyone can really convince Putin to end the war in Ukraine, and I don't think that Xi Jinping can pick up the phone, call Putin and say, the war must end and it must stop, in a week or a month or 6 months. Having said all of that, if there's any party that has leverage over Putin, it's Xi Jinping. And I think that it's important that Xi use that leverage, and that's probably what Macron's message to Xi is, that, number one, providing lethal aid to Russia is unacceptable. Number two, that Xi Jinping should speak to Zelensky, which he hasn't done since the invasion. And number three, China should use its leverage to bring Putin to the negotiating table and come forward with a real proposal to end the conflict.
David, thank you so much for your insight. David Sachs, research fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. So, Joe, he's really saying that this might not be the end of it, but potentially see a follow-up of China's actions, since this was quite muted. It was. And, of course, you asked Kevin McCarthy yesterday. He was adamant about the fact they didn't even talk about a visit, which seems kind of unrealistic, but he was promising a bipartisan codel to Taiwan. So I think a lot of this has to do with the Taiwanese elections in January. Keep it muted until that is over with. Make a trip next year. But something you probably didn't see, outside the Reagan Library was protesters for both sides. Some who say we are one China and other calling for Taipei's liberation. So the story's not going away.
That's for sure.
Coming at the program, with job cuts mounting and hiring activity losing momentum, all eyes will be on the March jobs report. That's tomorrow. We're going to break it down on what you need to expect when we return. This is Balance of Power. Welcome back to Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV. U.S. jobless claims ticking higher as focus shifts, of course, to tomorrow's payrolls report for the month of March. The consensus is calling for 230,000 jobs to be added. Joining us now is Anna Wong, chief U.S. economist of Bloomberg Economics. Anna, 230,000 is our consensus. What should we be looking at tomorrow? Is this an important jobs report?
Well, I think what we would be paying attention to is the unemployment rate. So unemployment rate is actually based on the household data rather than the non-farm payroll data. And we are expecting to see that it will tick up to 3.7% from 3.6%.
The expectation tomorrow, 230,000 jobs created. The whisper number keeps dropping. I've noticed on the terminal, even since this afternoon, at 218,000 now. Is there a growing belief that this is going to disappoint and then it becomes a bad news is good news scenario?
Yeah, so this week we have been seeing a weaker than consensus JOLTS number. Yep. We also saw the surprise with jobless claims, so that's why I think the consensus is dropping. Our view has always been that the labor market is softening more so than the headline numbers have been saying, and this actually precedes the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank collapse, because we looked into these layoff filings that firms have to report to the state labor department. And that actually, those data actually shows that a lot of these headlines of layoffs we saw in January and February only becomes effective in March and April. And so all this have led us to think that to expect that, yeah, we should be seeing more softening in the April and May data.
So if the unemployment rate rises, good news for the Fed,
right,
but bad news for the Biden administration.
Well, 3.7 is still a very slow number. In fact, we just put out a piece on the terminal today, which is about whether one should expect labor hoarding to keep the recession very mild. So I think what we found is based on historical evidence. Usually labor hoarding happens in the early part of a recession, and massive layoffs don't happen until 2 quarters after the recession begins. So I think that all the data would suggest that throughout this year, unemployment rate would still be pretty low, and they will only sharply rise sometime in the middle of next year.
Fascinating. Of course, the markets aren't going to be able to react to this report, Anne-Marie, until Monday. And we've got inflation data due on Tuesday.
Yeah, it's going to be a busy one.
So the investors, it could be days before we see a real reaction to this jobs report tomorrow.
Until they'll be able to adjust it for sure.
Many thanks to Bloomberg's Anna Wong. Coming up on Balance of Power, a new report raising ethics concerns over Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, who took vacations worth $500,000 paid for by a Dallas billionaire. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV. Thanks for joining us. A new report out from ProPublica we talked about earlier detailing a troubling relationship, I think we can say, between Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas and a billionaire from Dallas named Harlan Crow, Republican donor. The conservative justice has enjoyed $500,000 Bali vacations and other trips, all paid for by Crow. None were reported on his financial disclosure forms. But just who polices the highest court in the U.S.? Here to help us break it down is Tara-Leigh Grove, Vincent and Elkins Chair in Law at the University of Texas School of Law. Tara, it's great to see you. Thanks for joining us here today. We have pretty simple questions about this one because most people don't understand the way the opaque Supreme Court handles stuff like this. Was this an issue of a donor reaching too far or a justice who failed to report his actions?
Right. So I think we're not sure yet, right? There aren't that many ethics rules that apply to the U.S. Supreme Court. The justices do have some financial disclosure requirements. Those financial disclosure requirements were actually clarified just about a month ago or so. And so I think there's some questions about what exactly Justice Thomas needed to disclose and what he knew he needed to disclose. But I think this particular scenario raises broader questions about the lack of ethics rules for the United States Supreme Court.
Tara, that seems to be the way Dick Durbin and other lawmakers are taking this. Why is there no ethics in place? But I thought we put this to bed after Watergate.
So no, there are ethics rules that apply to the rest of the federal judiciary that do not apply to the United States Supreme Court. And this goes beyond financial disclosures to a variety of ethics rules. And it's interesting, when Congress considered applying ethics rules to the rest of the federal judiciary, members of Congress did at times propose applying these ethics rules to the Supreme Court as well, and ultimately Congress decided against it. And I think because of disclosures over the past several years, people are paying more and more attention to the fact that the Supreme Court isn't guided by the same standards as the rest of the federal judiciary.
That's for sure. Dick Durbin says, of course, Judiciary Committee, the highest court in the land should not have the lowest ethical standards. So what could Congress do, if anything, in this case, Tara?
So people disagree on this. I think Congress actually has a lot of power. There's a provision of the United States Constitution called the Necessary and Proper Clause that allows Congress to regulate a good deal of the federal government, and I think gives Congress some power even with respect to the federal judiciary. But short of that, the Supreme Court itself could adopt ethics rules, and the justices have, at least so far, not been too keen on that.
Yes, so if the justices are not going to want to adopt these ethics rules, it does look like as well in Congress this is falling on, as far as I could see so far, a lot of this is partisan lines. A lot of these are Democrats that are coming out and saying this is wrong.
So I think if you look over the history of the Supreme Court, different folks have pointed to different ethical problems with the justices depending on the moment. And so there has been support by both Democrats and Republicans at various times in our history for ethics rules. And I think if we take a broader view, one can see that there is benefit for everyone in having the Supreme Court be controlled by certain ethics provisions.
Tara, this has been framed, at least in media reports. This is originally, of course, ProPublica, but it's been picked up by a lot of news organizations. It's been framed as unprecedented. Is that fair?
So I think that's a really difficult question. Do I know of other justices getting trips of this magnitude from private donors? No. But one of the difficulties with the current disclosure requirements is that there may be a lot of things that we don't know, not just about the current set of justices, but also about things that have happened in the past. Justice Abe Fortas was both rejected as Chief Justice in 1968 and then ultimately resigned from the Supreme Court because of ethics concerns. He was way too close to the White House, way too close to Lyndon Johnson, and had some financial issues. They weren't of this magnitude, but they were of great concern to the point that he had to resign. So I think if we dug into Supreme Court justices over time, we might find some surprising things.
Could you see an actual resignation here with Justice Thomas?
I would not predict that.
Does the nature of the gift matter in this case, Tara? You know, it's not like he was going on a junket. This was a personal friend. We showed the statement from earlier today. You know, he was going on vacation with a friend. Is there anything wrong with that?
So I think this is why there may have been some confusion, at least up until the clarification in the very recent rules. There may have been some confusion about what one had to report and what one didn't. I mean, when it comes to public officials, some people play it very, very safe. I knew a judge pretty well, and he wouldn't even have a meal with me when I was arguing in front of other judges on the same court when I was at the Department of Justice, because he was just very careful about things. And other judges just kind of take a different approach, and other political figures take a different approach. And that's why it's helpful to have some guidelines for everyone.
Yeah, it does seem like, though, the guidelines that you're talking about will not be adopted if Congress doesn't act and the Justice Department doesn't want to put these guidelines on themselves. So will this just come down to the court of public opinion?
So I think it is very important to put pressure on an institution to adopt ethics rules. I think this kind of this kind of public attention is actually healthy for the Supreme Court because it could encourage the justices to adopt their own ethics rules. But I do think that if one took a broader view and didn't just focus on Justice Thomas, but we looked at all of the justices across history, this could be a topic that gets a lot of bipartisan support in Congress. If the rest of the federal judiciary is subject to ethics rules, why not the Supreme Court too?
Professor, many thanks. Professor Tara Leigh Grove with us to discuss this important story today involving Justice Clarence Thomas. Really something to consider here. It's hard to tell where this is going to go, but we're talking about someone who's an icon among conservatives. Right. And this is not going to make him more popular, obviously.
No, it's certainly not. Although I did get a phone call from a source who said, I have nothing but deepest humble respect from Harlan Crow, and I do believe this was probably one of his friends. But the issue isn't really the billionaire in Texas, is it?
Well, that's right.
The issue is the Supreme Court justice.
What do you do after you take the money, after you take the trip? And we still have a lot of questions about the way that was cataloged. I suspect we'll learn a lot more about it.
Yeah, certainly. Well, you saw those statements from lawmakers, especially from Democrats. They want answers. Well, let's see. Coming up in the program, though, more on this story. Plus, our political panel will join us to break down the SALT push from Republican lawmakers in New York. Yeah, SALT's not going away.
It's back.
Yeah, it's back. SALT is back. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Stay with us.
Now, keeping up to date with news from around the world, here's the first word. I'm John Hyland. The Biden administration is set to propose next week the toughest ever U.S. curbs on car pollution while stopping short of an electric vehicle mandate or ban on gas-powered models. The regulations are expected to further rein in emissions of carbon dioxide, nitrogen oxide, and other heat-trapping gases from cars and light trucks with model years 2027 to 2032. And as Anne-Marie just mentioned, the so-called SALT tax, the state and local deduction, is getting a new attention from Republican lawmakers. The SALT cap was set at $10,000 under former President Trump's tax law. Some of the ideas Republicans in New York are considering include doubling the cap for married couples, tying it to inflation, or marking the write-off on limited households that earn less than $400,000. Boeing plans to increase output of its 737 jet family in a push for more cash. That's according to people familiar with the matter. The U.S. plane maker will reportedly move a 38-plane monthly rate by mid-year, months earlier than analysts predicted. Boeing has been briefing customers on its plans to step up 737 production while hiring and training workers to support the move. And Chase Coleman's Tiger Global gained 7% in the first quarter as a rally in tech shares helped the firm come back from last year's record losses. The fund advanced more than 5% in March for its third straight positive month this year. That's according to a person familiar with the matter. The firm is seeking a rebound from a down year in 2021 and another in 2022 when the hedge fund tumbled 56% and the long-only fund 67%. A spokesperson for New York-based Tiger Global declined to comment. Global news 24 hours a day on air and on Bloomberg Originals, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm John Hyland. This is Bloomberg.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV. Now, a $500,000 vacation to Bali is just one of the many luxury gifts enjoyed by Justice Clarence Thomas from billionaire Republican donor Harlan Crow. Joining us now for more on that story is our political panel. Joe Crowley, Senior Policy Director at Denton Public Policy, and Rick Davis, Partner at Stone Court Capital. Welcome to the table. Rick, let's start with you because this is really your party. What do you make of this? I mean, it could just be friendly, but the numbers are astronomical if he were to pay for these vacations, which many are viewing as gifts himself.
Yeah, first of all, I don't think it's limited to Republicans doing this with Republican members in the Supreme Court and vice versa. I think this is a culture that the court has, that they believe that they can do these things with impunity. The bottom line is there are rules against this in the Supreme Court. Especially specific in this case to travel. You cannot take private travel, even though it's a friend of yours, and you got to report it and you got to pay for it. And so is a yacht private travel? Is it at home of Harlan Crow? Now, Harlan Crow owns some of these facilities, but the question is, was that a private event, or was that something that he was going to in his public capacity? The bottom line is he probably does have specific exposure on the travel portion, because that is pretty clear what the rules are, and it looks like he's broken them. The bottom line is it's a different standard between an administration appointee, a member of Congress, and then the Supreme Court. And they ought to unify those standards. Everybody ought to have to do the same thing, with reporting and with limitations. And I don't know why the Supreme Court is still in the 19th century on these issues versus the 21st century.
Well, let's talk about that for a minute, Joe, because you remember when you were in Congress, people couldn't take you out for the fancy steak dinners and all that following campaign finance reform. Should the Supreme Court be held to the same standard? What is it, a $50 limit?
Yeah, they might buy my vote for $50. I mean, God forbid, Right. But the reality is, I think Rick is right. This is not just a Republican issue, because, members of the Supreme Court are supposed to be impartial, right? They're not supposed to make decisions based on party affiliation. And Rick is also right that members of Congress and the administration are held to a much higher standard. And point blank, just the appearance alone is what I think really puts them at risk in terms of their credibility, which is hurting already. And this only further hurts that. We were talking outside before. They have actually memberships to country clubs. Members of Congress could never have that. Members of the administration can't have that. Why does the Supreme Court have those abilities? It's just something smells. Senator Whitehouse has been on this for quite some time, and he's really been onto something. And I think this is going to grow. The need for an investigation, the need for more transparency is what Rick is mentioning as well. Report it.
Could this actually pass Congress, though?
Well, it's a real question, I think, in terms of how this will come about, because there are the clear separations of power. But Congress, has the ability to hold hearings and to really embarrass the heck out of them. I think what comes down to, it's a standard that they have to create for themselves. They have to have that standard that is they don't want legislation. What they want, what they should want, is to create a standard that they live by themselves that gets us over the smell test.
Rick, you made the point here. The Republicans don't have a lock on this. This is Washington. And while we're hearing a lot of outrage from Democratic lawmakers now, I just wonder what would bring both sides together on this, and if there could be a bipartisan approach.
Look, I do think there is a feeling that the court has a different standard that they apply by. And as Joe says, the gold standard on this has been Sheldon Whitehouse and the work that he's been doing on it. And so shining a bright light, this could actually be a tipping point. These kinds of things usually force things to happen in Washington. Yeah, right. Usually nothing happens in a vacuum. You got to have a scandal. We got a good scandal now, and so let's get something done.
And Donald Trump loves what's happening right now.
That's right.
He loves the Supreme Court all of a sudden. So.
But it's going to be up to the court. Justice Roberts has to look at this and say, we've got to reform our own institution. If they let everybody else try to do it, it's not going to wind up the way they're going to want it to be.
That's right.
And of course, in response to this ProPublica report, do you think there could be a resignation?
I think there is likely to be an investigation. This is such a blatant violation of the rules that they have already, right? We can say that there are other rules they ought to have, but the rules they have now look like they've been violated. There's no way to rationalize taking a private jet somewhere and not having to either report it or pay for it.
Yeah, right. Well,
and I do think Democrats will, shockingly, call for Thomas's resignation. I have no doubt.
He's not going to be called to testify, right?
I highly doubt it.
Can you get a Supreme Court justice on Capitol Hill?
Subpoena him.
That would be a whole new level. But this has been a week of unprecedented events, Joe. Why not?
It is, and it's still hard to wrap your head around what has happened this week in terms of President Trump and what happened up in New York, and to have this now happen as well. I think in many respects it really demonstrates how dysfunctional everything right now appears to be in terms of the body of American politics. Yeah. And it's hitting the legislative, it's hitting the executive, and now it's hitting the Supreme Court.
And you're right, it's eroding people's trust.
The erosion of trust has been going on for quite some time, especially in the Supreme Court. We see the numbers of Congress are way down. The president's numbers are way down. And now Supreme Court numbers are going to be way, way down.
Yeah, pretty shocking they couldn't find the leaker, huh? All right, coming up, our political panel will be sticking with us as we go to SALT. It's back. The SALT tax deduction, and negotiations surrounding the debt ceiling. It's all ahead on Balance of Power. This is Bloomberg. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV. Thanks for joining us. The newest champions for SALT tax breaks, Republican lawmakers in New York. Our political panel back with us to discuss. Joe Crowley, Senior Policy Director at Denton Public Policy, of course, former Congressman, and Rick Davis is here, partner at Stone Court Capital. Joe, I've got to start with you as the New Yorker here. You finally got some love from the Republican side now, because remember how the midterms went for New York, and that might actually mean a break in this story.
Well, this is a long time in the making. This goes back to 2017 and the Trump tax cuts. And I was on the Ways and Means Committee decrying the elimination of SALT back then, and it's kind of interesting to see how these has all turned around, or turned about, so to speak, where Republicans, and by the way, many of the Republicans who voted against it are still in Congress are decrying this as well and wanted to see it changed. But you come from an area, a city like New York, and big cities like New York, where the house my parents bought in Woodside, Queens for $24,000 is now worth $1 million. My dad bought it on a detective's salary. What detective could afford to live in a house like that? 3-bedroom, 1 bathroom. And so I think it goes to show that, there are middle-class people struggling to some degree. Their only asset is their home, and now they're being doubly taxed. Or that's the argument you make, because it's been going on for quite some time, and now it's been taken away. So is it a tax? Was it not a tax? It all depends on your perspective.
I'm from New York, and I know we share different baseball team loves, but you hear this a lot when you're in New York. People want this SALT break back. Do you think it could pass this Congress?
Well, I think that Tom Suozzi did a really good job before he left.
Mr. SALT.
Yes, exactly, in terms of ratcheting this up a bit when he ran for governor, too. I do think that because you have so many vulnerable Republicans in New York State, there may be an attempt to try to find a way to massage that a bit by McCarthy and others to help them go back with something. It's not clear to me, though, because the number is a large number, and how do you replace that? How do you fill that gap? And that was always the argument, give us an alternative. If we're not going to do this, what would we do? And you really couldn't come up with $400 billion, whatever the number was back then.
There are progressive Democrats, Rick, who say this is a giveaway to billionaires. Are there enough Republicans to help make the difference?
Well, I think this is the classic, Republicans can take it away. We're the only ones who can give it back to you. So, look, I think they're going to try and tweak it. I mean, there's talk about giving a marriage deduction so that if you're married, you can take, 2 deductions, and instead of $10,000, be $20,000. And I think Joe's right. I mean, it's too big a number to actually fix the way it used to be. It'll never be that way again. Maybe Albany should think about cutting the state taxes to come halfway, so it's not just on the federal balance sheet. Yeah. But look, nothing's going to happen until you get a budget and you get this debt ceiling fixed. Right. And until that happens, this is off the table.
That's exactly what I wanted to talk about, because I spoke to Speaker McCarthy about the debt ceiling yesterday. Take a listen to what he had to say. You're going to put this all in a bill and try to pass it in the House. When?
Unfortunately, I tried to sit down with the president, and the president doesn't want to communicate. We're out of session right now. When we come back, you might make some news.
When will we potentially get this bill on the floor? Now, this is what they want to outline to get their votes to sign up for a debt ceiling raise. Do you think he has his members in line to be able to get this bill, potential cheat sheet almost?
I think there's no chance that those members are in line yet. I mean, this is the crisis caucus. I mean, the chaos caucus.
But this has to be the strategy, because the Biden administration thinks they could divide and conquer.
Well, I think that's probably a good strategy for the Biden administration, but he's got to have something to shoot at. He can't actually get that caucus rounded up without something on the table. And it'll get amended, it'll get changed, it'll get massaged, and so it won't look exactly like what goes out on the first day. But it's got to create some momentum right now, because he is very much on defense. I mean, I think the White House has done a good job of saying, hey, look, we'd love to have something happen here, but we've put our budget out. Where's yours?
Where's your plan? Joe, look, when they come back, as Kevin McCarthy said, we're out of session right now. They could have as little as 6 weeks to figure this out, depending on when X date lands.
Yeah.
S&P downgraded our debt 2 weeks before X date in 2011. You remember this very well.
Do. Yeah.
So are we going to talk about prioritization or potential default?
Well, we were talking about a longer and extended stay away from Washington if that's the case. I think really the reality is that they have to deal with this. They'll have to come back.
A clean bill?
I think the debt ceiling will be raised ultimately. It's just, as Rick said, this is the chaos caucus in terms of he's on the defense. There's divide and splits we're reading about in his conference right now. Sorry?
He wouldn't say he's on the defense, but he says
No.
he's only having letters right now between him and Biden. He wants discussions. We're going to have to leave it there. Our political panel, Joe Crowley and, of course, Rick Davis. Thank you so much for joining us. Check out all these stories and more in the Balance of Power newsletter on the terminal and online. Thanks for joining us. We'll be back Monday.